All right. This lesson today will come from Chapter 2, Part 3, the Restoration Colonies. And after this lesson, you'll only have 31 more chapters to go. The Restoration Colonies are actually comprised of the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, along with South and North Carolina, as well as Georgia. The name is actually derived from the fact that after the English Civil War, there was a 10-year period where Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans had ruled England during what was known as the Commonwealth. However, in 1660, Charles II is restored to the English throne, hence Restoration Colonies. For it is after he had been restored to power that these colonies are settled. Originally, however, it's Henry Hudson, who is an Englishman, sailing for the Dutch, that explores this region, hence the reason why the river bears his name. And as the Dutch settle in what becomes known as the New Netherlands, they're looking for a commercial interest, looking for profit rather than permanent settlement. And those that had come over, though small in number, were part of a business venture looking to bring in money for the Dutch through trade. However, by 1664, Charles II in England looks to take the New Netherlands by force, and they're able to take it without much of a struggle at all, actually. However, as once they do take this region over, they do allow the Dutch to keep their lifestyles and kind of way of life. And so, whereas the Dutch had settled upon Long Island and named it New Amsterdam, and it had become a very diverse region, which kind of characterizes the middle colonies. In fact, in New Amsterdam, it was supposedly that over 18 different languages were spoken, and even numerous freed blacks had lived. However, eventually, once the English take them over by King Charles, he eventually gives this land to his brother James II, the Duke of York, hence the name New York. And it is at this time then that the English are able to kind of ward off their commercial rivals, the Dutch. We now turn our attention to the colony of Pennsylvania, named after William Penn. Penn comes from a wealthy aristocratic family, and whose father was actually friends with the king. However, this doesn't stop William from bringing great consternation to his father for some of his beliefs, and even William ends up in jail for some of them. And as a Quaker, Penn was a pacifist who believed that everybody possessed the inner light, or could possess it, and therefore could be saved. And William preached conversion constantly, and talked about salvation, and that everybody could be saved. That not just some people were predestined or anything like that, but you could do things to try to improve your chances of being saved. Another thing that caused conflict for William was the belief that all people were equals, and that he wouldn't treat the upper class with any deference. He also wouldn't swear any oaths, and some of these beliefs then got him in trouble, and as you can see, even expelled from Oxford. However, in 1681, he actually does obtain a royal land grant from the king, King Charles II. Now, why might the king give him this land if he was kind of had caused trouble? Perhaps it was because of his father's relationship. Maybe it was to get him out of England. However, once he does get this grant, he will advertise all over Europe in various languages with pamphlets and newsletters trying to sell land and encourage settlement in Pennsylvania. And as you can see, by 1685, Over 8,000 immigrants from all different countries and religions had come to Pennsylvania, creating quite a diverse population. And once there, they discovered the excellent farmland and created a unicameral legislature. And this diversity, brought about good and bad things, sometimes creating kind of quarrelsome politics. Another thing that sets Penn apart from other colonial leaders at this time is in his dealings with the Native Americans. He was known for having created these treaties that would kind of make deals with the natives to buy their land rather than simply forcing the natives off of their land. And he had cultivated such friendly relations with these natives that he felt secure and free to walk amongst the natives unarmed without the fear of any attack. However, even with his good intentions, it was the non Quakers who treated the natives rather poorly, which sometimes undermined the Quakers' actions and intentions. And by looking at the population growth here, starting the period of 1650 and leading right up to the Revolutionary War, you can see that it's several middle colony urban centers that increased their population quite dramatically, and that being New York and Philadelphia, surpassing that of Boston in New England and Charleston of South Carolina. And here you can see some of the settlement patterns, how some of the immigrants would move westward to look for farmland and kind of where they would live. And the Scots-Irish kind of being one of the larger subgroups that moved in during this time prior to the Revolution. And you can see how they had made up a big chunk of the population, over 50%, in several areas in Pennsylvania there. We now turn our attention to the restoration colonies of the lower South, and we'll take a look at North and South Carolina and Georgia. These colonies developed very similar settlement patterns to Virginia and Maryland, just to the north, and kind of will base their economy on agriculture that depended on slave labor. And just like their northern counterparts here, are never really as cohesive because they are spread out more and they have very few port towns or large urban centers besides Charleston. And what we see is that people who had stayed loyal to the monarchy, during the English Civil War and had maybe fled to, and exiled themselves to foreign lands, came back with the restoration of King Charles, and they started looking for favors for their loyalty. And John Colleton was one who had stayed loyal and had been in Barbados, and he returns to England where he eventually secures a land grant in 1663. Now he knew he wouldn't get rich quick, but he was looking for ways to try to get people to come and claim the new land so that he could make money. But with peaceful times having returned to England, there were very few takers willing to travel the Atlantic and settle in a new place so far away. And because of the time period of peace and prosperity in England during this time, people were quite slow to move to this area. But as it turns out, the tiny island of Barbados had been prospering, and its population, both free and slave populations, had continued to grow. And it was this Barbadian connection where wealthy planters, their sons, didn't have any land to be granted to them, and so they would buy land in the Carolinas to come and bring some slaves with them and to kind of start their own life anew there. And once we see the population continue to grow in the Carolinas, they tried several crops, including tobacco, cotton, silk, grapes, to name a few. However, it wasn't until 1690 when rice turned out to be the main staple crop of export that would bring in a good deal of wealth to these planters. And later on, you also see an increase in indigo being harvested as well. And so the early population can be contributed to or attributed to Barbados for having brought over colonials and slaves to populate the region. And so, as you can see here, the importance of the exports, especially rice, but also indigo. And finally, then we have to turn our attention to Georgia. And what we see is a British general, James Oglethorpe, had kind of seen the continuing or growing menace of the Spanish further south in Florida and saw the threat that was posed as these two nations kind of continued to grow closer to each other. And what he looked to do was to try to populate kind of a frontier or buffer zone, which eventually turns into Georgia. And he looks to populate this colony with maybe people who were in prison back in England for falling into debt, or encouraging other people to move there to try to thwart any possible aggression by the Spanish moving northwards. And therefore, in 1733, to try to get more people to move to this Georgia region, it was promised 50 acres and tools and supplies to each immigrant that would move into this area. However, there were some strict laws like there would be no booze, no slaves, and they would not be able to sell their property. However, eventually by 1751, these rules are abandoned for various reasons, including the idea that how could the planters of this region compete economically with planters further north that did have the availability of slavery. And therefore, by the early 1700s, we see the final of the 13 original colonies taking shape to look like this. And whether it be the Chesapeake, New England, or Restoration Colonies, they each get settled for various reasons, whether it be religious, economic, a new start, new land, search for riches, and they will continue to be populated and grow, developing distinct political and economic institutions that are unique to each of their regions. And at this point, you should be able to compare all three of the regions, the New England, Chesapeake, and Restoration colonies, in some detail.